February 24th, 1944, 12:37 p.m. The sky over Schweinfurt darkened, not from storm clouds but from wings, thousands of them. German soldiers froze mid-step. Anti-aircraft crews stared upward, speechless. To them, it looked like the end of the world. An unending swarm of American bombers stretched horizon to horizon, each one a flying fortress, each one carrying the weight of a nation's industry. The droning roar built into a symphony of inevitability, drowning out every other sound. Men who had survived the frozen hell of the Eastern Front felt something they had not felt in years, pure, primal fear. They called it der schwarze Himmel, the black sky. And on that day, German troops realized something dreadful. The war was no longer theirs to win. It was America's to finish. This is the story of the day. The sky itself became a weapon. By 1944, Nazi Germany stood cornered but defiant. Its armies still held Europe. Its factories still roared. But above them, the air had turned hostile. For years, the Luftwaffe had dominated the skies. Their Messerschmitts had carved through enemy formations with terrifying precision. Their pilots had become legends, aces who hunted Allied aircraft like prey. But now the hunters had become the hunted. Across the Atlantic, a new kind of warfare was taking shape. One fought not in trenches or forests, but from 25,000 feet above. The United States Army Air Forces believed that daylight precision bombing could cripple the German war machine. Factories, oil refineries, railways, nothing was safe. Every industrial heartbeat of the Reich became a target marked on maps in American war rooms thousands of miles away. Yet, for German soldiers and civilians on the ground, these raids were not abstract strategies. They were apocalypse made visible. The distant hum that started as a whisper grew into thunder. Shadows rippled across fields and cities. Then came the whistling descent, the explosions that shook the earth, the fires that consumed everything they touched. The central question was no longer, could Germany fight? Every soldier knew the answer to that. German troops still fought with ferocity, born of desperation and discipline. The question had become something far more terrifying. How long could it endure? And on certain days, when the bombers came in waves too vast to count, when the sky itself seemed to bear down upon them, like an iron ceiling descending, even most hardened Wehrmacht men whispered the same word, unmöglich, impossible. They had conquered nations. They had marched through Poland, France, and deep into Russia. They had believed in victory as an article of faith. But faith cannot stop steel. Prayer cannot turn back engines. And courage, however fierce, cannot hold back the sky when it turns black with wings. What follows is not just the story of machines and tonnage of industrial capacity and military strategy. It is the story of men who looked up and saw their own defeat written in contrails. It is the story of a sky that stopped being neutral and became an executioner. The battle for Germany's skies began in American factories. Between 1942 and 1944, United States industry achieved something no empire in history had matched. It was not merely production, it was transformation. A nation that had languished in depression just years before now operated on a scale that defied comprehension. One B-17 bomber rolled off an American assembly line every 63 minutes. Think about that. Every hour, another fortress took shape. Every day, another squadron's worth of aircraft. Every week, enough bombers to darken a city's sky. Women in Michigan riveted aluminum skins by day, their hands moving with practiced precision along fuselages that gleamed under factory lights. Men in Texas assembled Pratt & Whitney engines by night, each cylinder a miracle of engineering, each propeller blade balanced to perfection. In California, bombardiers trained on Norden bomb sites, while their aircraft were still being born in distant plants. This was the arsenal of democracy, President Roosevelt's promise made manifest in steel and fire. Each bomber carried 4 tons of explosives, but they carried something else too, the faith of an entire nation that machines could break a tyrant, that assembly lines could defeat armies, that a country built on freedom and innovation could outproduce an empire built on conquest and slave labor. The numbers told a story that German intelligence refused to believe. Early reports of 1,000-bomber raids sounded like Allied propaganda, the kind of exaggeration meant to demoralize rather than inform. Surely no nation could sustain such production. Surely the Americans were counting every trainer, every transport, every obsolete aircraft in their inventory. Until the raids began, until the first waves came. German radar operators watched their screens in disbelief as blips multiplied beyond counting. Luftwaffe pilots scrambled into the sky, expecting to face dozens of bombers, and found themselves staring at hundreds. Anti-aircraft crews prepared for another engagement and witnessed formations that stretched beyond the horizon in every direction. America wasn't just building planes, it was building inevitability. Every B-17 that fell over Germany, and thousands did fall, spiraling down in flames, with 10 men screaming inside, was replaced before its loss could even be reported. Every crew that died was mourned, buried, and replaced by fresh-faced boys from Iowa and Georgia, who climbed into identical aircraft and flew the same missions. The Luftwaffe could shoot down 100 bombers in a single day and consider it a victory. And the next day, 100 more would come. And the day after that, 200. The mathematics of it were brutal and beautiful in their simplicity. America could replace its losses. Germany could not. In the factories of the Ruhr Valley, German workers labored under the same principles: maximum production, total mobilization. But they worked under the bombs now. They worked in shifts that were interrupted by sirens in buildings that had been rebuilt 3 times, alongside slave laborers who sabotaged what they could and prayed for liberation. The Industrial War had become a race between 2 philosophies. Germany believed in efficiency through domination. America believed in abundance through freedom. One system drove men until they broke. The other paid them overtime and gave them Sundays off. And in the skies over Europe, that difference revealed itself in aluminum and fire. German anti-aircraft gunner Hans Reuter recalled the first time he saw them. "The sky was moving," he wrote years later in a letter that would survive him. "It shimmered with silver." His battery had been positioned outside Schweinfurt for 3 months. They had seen raids before, quick strikes, precision attacks that came and went like summer storms. The men had grown almost casual about it. Helmets stayed unbuckled. Cigarettes were smoked between alerts. Someone always had coffee brewing on a makeshift stove. That morning began like any other. Clear skies, cold air. The kind of February day where your breath hung visible and your fingers ached inside woolen gloves. Then the sirens wailed. At first men cheered, thinking perhaps it was a drill or maybe a small formation they could handle. They had shot down American bombers before. They knew the drill lead the target account for altitude fire in bursts to conserve ammunition. Then came the sound, not the sharp scream of diving Stukas or the whine of fighters. This was different, a rolling thunder that started as a whisper and built into something that made the ground tremble. It came from everywhere and nowhere, a bass rumble that resonated in your chest cavity, that made your teeth ache, that seemed to vibrate through the earth itself. Reuter looked up. The horizon was gone. In its place, a wall of aircraft extending as far as the eye could see in every direction. Wave after wave of flying fortresses filled the heavens, stacked in perfect formations. Each box formation containing dozens of bombers, each bomber bristling with guns and pregnant with death. To the Germans below, it seemed endless. When one formation passed overhead, another appeared behind it, and behind that, another. The sky had become a river of aluminum and death flowing inexorably toward its target. When the sun vanished behind them, literally blocked out by thousands of wings, one soldier in Reuter's battery whispered, "Es ist, als hätte sich der Himmel gegen uns gewendet." It's like the sky has turned against us. Even hardened Wehrmacht veterans, men who had survived Stalingrad's frozen nightmare, who had endured the Eastern Front's brutality, who had seen things that hollowed out their souls, stared upward in disbelief. They had faced Soviet human wave attacks. They had weathered artillery barrages that turned the earth to soup. They had fought in conditions that broke lesser men. But this was different. This was not something you could fight. This was not an enemy you could shoot, or bayonet, or outmaneuver. This was the sky itself turned weapon. "You cannot fight the sky," Reuter wrote. "You can only hide from it." His battery opened fire anyway. What else could they do? The 88mm guns barked and recoiled, sending shells screaming upward into the formation. Black flak bursts blossomed around the bombers like deadly flowers. Here and there, a fortress would shudder, trailing smoke. Occasionally, one would fall a small victory, a prayer answered. But for every bomber that fell, 50 more flew on. The formation barely noticed its losses.
cannot fight the sky.
It simply absorbed them, closed the gaps, and continued forward with the mechanical indifference of a machine that knew it could afford to bleed. The Germans fired until their ammunition ran low. They fired until their gun barrels glowed red. They fired because stopping meant accepting the unacceptable, that they were powerless beneath that darkened sky. Every bomber was part of a system, a machine of staggering precision. The lead aircraft in each formation carried the Norden bomb sight, a device so secret that bombardiers swore oaths to destroy it, rather than let it fall into enemy hands. This mechanical marvel, they were told, could drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 25,000 feet. In theory. In practice, high winds turned carefully calculated trajectories into guesswork. Flak bursts shook the aircraft at the critical moment of release, scattering bombs across neighborhoods instead of factories. Smoke from earlier hits obscured the target completely, forcing bombardiers to estimate, to guess, to pray, their mathematics aligned with reality. Yet the Americans persisted with an almost religious faith in their doctrine. Daylight precision bombing. The phrase itself carried the weight of conviction. Unlike the British, who carpet-bombed cities at night, the Americans believed they could be surgical. They could strike the factory and spare the hospital. They could destroy the ball-bearing plant and leave the apartment building standing. The reality was messier, bloodier, more chaotic than any briefing room acknowledged. Factories in Schweinfurt, critical producers of ball bearings that kept every Wehrmacht vehicle rolling, were struck again and again. Each raid cost dozens of planes and hundreds of lives. B-17 seconds fell from the sky, like wounded birds, their crews tumbling through freezing air, hoping their parachutes would open, praying they would land somewhere they might survive. Oil refineries in Ploiești, Romania burned for weeks after American attacks. The smoke rose so high it was visible from 100 miles away. Railway marshalling yards were cratered so thoroughly that some never functioned again. Synthetic fuel plants, Germany's answer to its petroleum shortage, were reduced to twisted metal and shattered concrete. The targeting was methodical, almost scientific in its brutality. American intelligence identified choke points in the German war economy and hammered them without mercy. If Germany needed ball bearings, destroy the ball bearing factories. If it needed fuel, incinerate the refineries. If it needed transportation, obliterate the railways. Each raid delivered its payload with the precision of a surgeon or the randomness of a butcher, depending on how the wind blew that day. Yet the message was clear, regardless of accuracy. There was no safe place left in Germany. No factory could hide. No railway junction could escape notice. No industrial center could assume it would see tomorrow. For the Wehrmacht soldier, below every distant hum became a warning. You learned to distinguish the sound, the deep throb of American bombers during daylight, the different pitch of British Lancasters after dark. Your ears became instruments of survival, cataloguing threats by their acoustic signatures alone. For the civilians, mothers, clutching children, old men who remembered the previous war factory workers, whose shifts never seemed to end, every siren became a prayer. You grabbed what you could and ran for the shelters. You descended into the earth and waited while the world above shook itself apart. You emerged, if you emerged, to discover whether your home still stood or had been replaced by rubble and memory. The mathematics of destruction were calculated in Washington and executed over Germany. Tonnage dropped, sorties flown, targets struck. Each number represented 1,000 small tragedies, a family buried alive, a wedding photo incinerated, a child who would never grow old. And still, the bombers came, day after day, week after week, an industrial heartbeat that never stopped, never slowed, never showed mercy. In 1943, the Luftwaffe still believed it could stop the raids. They threw everything into the sky. Messerschmitt Bf, 109 seconds that climbed like rockets. Focke-Wulf, 190 seconds that hit like hammers. Even experimental jets that screamed past the bombers at speeds no propeller-driven aircraft could match. German fighter pilots were among the best in the world, men whose names were spoken with reverence and fear. Galland Hartmann Marseille. But courage cannot multiply fuel, skill cannot manufacture replacement parts, and individual brilliance cannot overcome mathematics. The attrition was merciless, mechanical, unstoppable. Every time the bombers came, the Luftwaffe had to respond. They had no choice. To let the formations pass unopposed meant surrendering their cities to fire, so they scrambled. They climbed into the freezing air, Oxygen masks strapped tight fingers, numb on the controls, and threw themselves at formations bristling with 50 caliber machine guns. Each bomber carried 10 men and 13 guns. Each formation contained dozens of bombers positioned so their fields of fire overlapped, creating a flying fortress. In truth, a metal hedgehog that spat death in every direction. Attack from above, and the top turrets tracked you. Attack from below, and the ball turret gunner waited. Attack from the side and waist, gunners opened fire, while the tail gunner covered your escape route. German pilots learned to attack head-on, diving straight at the cockpit where the firepower was weakest. It required nerves of steel, 2 aircraft hurtling toward each other at combined speeds, exceeding 500 miles per hour, firing all the way, pulling away at the last possible second before collision. Sometimes they didn't pull away in time. By late 1944, Germany had lost 17,000 fighter pilots, men who could never be replaced. These were not just bodies. They were years of training, thousands of flight hours, irreplaceable experience. You could build a new Messerschmitt in weeks. You could not build a new ace in any amount of time. The Luftwaffe's training programs shortened, desperate to fill the gaps. Pilots went into combat with 100 hours of flight time instead of 300. They faced American bomber formations defended by long-range P-51 Mustangs fighters that could escort the bombers all the way to Berlin, and back fighters flown by pilots who had survived dozens of missions and learned every trick of aerial combat. The new German pilots lasted days, sometimes hours. Each bomber formation drew in the defenders like a trap burning through their dwindling fuel and their irreplaceable souls. The Luftwaffe was bleeding to death in the sky, one sortie at a time, one pilot at a time, one empty chair in the mess hall at a time. The mathematics of defeat were written not in courage, but in fuel shortages and graves. By winter 1944, the Luftwaffe was rationing aviation fuel. Pilots sat in ready rooms with aircraft they couldn't fly, watching the bombers pass overhead, impotent witnesses to their nation's destruction. By the time new planes like the Me-262 jet fighter arrived, revolutionary aircraft that could outrun and outclimb anything the Allies had, there was no one left to fly them. Or rather, there were pilots but no fuel. Or there was fuel but no parts. Or there were parts but the factory that made them had been bombed into rubble the previous week. Germany was eating itself, trying to stop what could not be stopped. Hamburg, Dresden, Kassel. The names became synonyms for annihilation. When British night bombers joined the Americans in around the clock, operations' entire cities vanished in flame. The strategy had a clinical name, dehousing. The reality was medieval in its horror. In July 1943, Hamburg burned so fiercely that asphalt melted underfoot. The city had endured raids before, but this was different. This was systematic. The British came first at night, dropping high explosives that blew roofs off buildings and shattered water mains. Then came the incendiaries, thousands upon thousands of them, small magnesium bombs that ignited everything they touched. The fires merged, they grew, they fed on themselves, and then the physics of hell took over. The heat created its own wind, a firestorm that sucked oxygen from the air and turned the city into a blast furnace. Trees were uprooted by the wind and flung into the inferno. People who sought shelter in basements suffocated as the fires above consumed all available oxygen. Those who ran into the streets were lifted off their feet by winds exceeding 100 miles per hour and thrown into the flames. 40,000 people died in 2 nights. On the ground, German soldiers tried to save civilians, but the heat lifted them off their feet. Firefighters arrived to find their hoses melted, their water sources dry, their equipment useless against an apocalypse. There was nothing to do but watch and bear witness. A mother was found holding her children, all 3 carbonized into a single sculpture of ash. A man's last act had been to shield his dog, both preserved in that final moment, like Pompeii's victims. In some basements, the heat was so intense that entire families were reduced to residue identifiable only by the number of shadows on the wall. The air war had crossed a moral line from strategy to annihilation. Military historians would debate it for generations. Was it necessary? Did it shorten the war? Did the destruction of civilian morale contribute to Germany's defeat, or did it merely kill civilians while hardening resolve? The men who ordered the raids believed one truth: the faster destruction, the sooner the war would end. Every factory worker killed was one fewer laborer building tanks. Every apartment building destroyed was one more blow to German industrial capacity. Every mother who fled the cities was one less pair of hands supporting the war machine. And yet the raids continued, night after night, city after city. Kassel was 90% destroyed in a single night. Darmstadt burned until there was nothing left to burn. Würzburg, a Baroque masterpiece, a city of culture and history, was obliterated in 17 minutes of bombing that killed 5,000 people. For German soldiers rotating back from the front, the shock was profound. They had left to fight a war and returned to find their homes erased from the earth. The addresses where they had grown up no longer existed. The streets they had walked as children were fields of rubble. Their families, if they survived, lived in cellars or had fled to the countryside. The psychological impact was incalculable. Soldiers fought with the knowledge that their loved ones faced death from above while they faced it on the ground. There was no safe place, no home front. The entire nation had become a battlefield, and still the sky offered no mercy. By late 1944, the results were visible from space had satellites existed. Synthetic oil production fell by 90%. The lifeblood of modern warfare simply stopped flowing. Tanks that should have been racing toward the front sat motionless in depot yards waiting for fuel that would never come. Luftwaffe fighters remained grounded, not because they lacked pilots or courage, but because their fuel tanks were empty. Railway transport collapsed under the weight of precision bombing. Marshalling yards that once coordinated thousands of trains daily became graveyards of twisted steel and overturned cars. The arteries that connected Germany's war machine, carrying coal from the Ruhr, iron ore from captured territories, ammunition to the front, were severed one by one. Bridges fell. Viaducts crumbled. Locomotives were destroyed faster than they could be replaced. The famous German efficiency, that legendary organizational precision that had conquered half of Europe, ground to a halt amid the rubble. Orders were issued from Berlin that could not be executed because the units they were meant for never received them. Supplies were manufactured in factories that had no way to ship them to soldiers who desperately needed them. The Wehrmacht still fought bravely on the ground, but behind them their lifelines were ash. In Normandy, panzer divisions that should have crushed the Allied beachhead arrived days late, starved of fuel, unable to maneuver. When they finally engaged, they fought with ammunition rationed by the shell. Mechanics cannibalized broken vehicles to keep a few running. Horses were pressed back into service because trucks had no gasoline. It was like fighting while bleeding, one officer wrote in his diary. You could feel the strength leaving the Reich with every passing hour. Ball-bearing plants in Schweinfurt bombed repeatedly, despite horrific American losses finally stopped production. Without ball bearings, every mechanical system degraded. Tank transmissions failed. Aircraft engines seized. Even small arms became less reliable, as quality control suffered from lack of precision components. The industrial web that supported modern warfare was delicate, interconnected, vulnerable. Break one strand and the whole thing weakened. Break a dozen strands and it collapsed entirely. Above them, the sky never cleared again. Bomber formations became as regular as sunrise. German civilians learned to time their days around the raids. Morning raids were usually American high-altitude daylight precision attacks. Evening raids were British night bombing area attacks, firestorms. The psychological toll was devastating. You could not rest, you could not plan. Every day might be your last, and there was nothing you could do to change it. No amount of digging, no depth of shelter, no prayer or hope or desperate bargain could protect you when your number came up. Factory workers showed up to plants that had been bombed the night before and were told to clear the rubble and resume production. They worked in buildings without roofs in winter, cold with inadequate tools, knowing that tonight or tomorrow the bombers would return and destroy whatever they rebuilt. The futility was crushing. You could see it in their faces, in the way their shoulders slumped, in how they flinched at every distant sound. Germany was not merely being defeated, it was being dismantled piece by piece, factory by factory, city by city. The industrial might that had seemed so unstoppable in 1940 was revealed as fragile, dependent on systems that could be broken from the air. And break they did, systematically, relentlessly, without pause or mercy. High above the smoke, the air crews lived by minutes. Each mission meant flying through walls of flak steel, bursts that shredded wings and men alike. The explosions appeared as black flowers blooming in the sky, beautiful and deadly, close enough to rock the aircraft, close enough to send shrapnel tearing through aluminum skin and human flesh with equal indifference. Inside the bombers, 10 men breathed oxygen through masks in air so cold it froze saliva. At 25,000 feet, the temperature dropped to 40 below zero. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes. Exposed skin stuck to metal. The condensation from your breath turned to ice crystals on your goggles. And through it all, you flew straight and level toward the target, because evasive maneuvers meant scattered bombs, and scattered bombs meant failure. "We could see parachutes opening," said navigator John Miller in an interview decades later. His voice still carried the weight of those memories, sometimes burning. They knew what their bombs did. They were not blind to the consequences. From 5 miles up, you could see the flash of impact, the bloom of smoke, the spreading fires. Sometimes on clear days you could see people running in the streets below, tiny figures scattering like ants. But they also knew what Nazi tyranny had done. They had seen the newsreels from liberated camps. They had heard the stories from refugees. They understood in the abstract way that distance allows that their bombs were falling on a regime built on genocide and conquest. In the cold air of 25,000 feet, morality froze alongside everything else. You did not think about the woman in the shelter or the child in the basement. You could not afford to. You thought about your crew, your mission, your survival. You thought about the fighter diving out of the sun at your 10 o'clock position. You thought about the flak barrage ahead that you had to fly through because there was no way around it. The moral calculations happened later, if they happened at all. In bunks at night when sleep would not come. In quiet moments between missions when the adrenaline faded and the weight settled in. In letters home that you could never quite finish because the words would not capture the complexity of what you were doing. Many came home changed, not victorious, but haunted. They had survived when so many others had not. Why them? Why not the crew in the next aircraft? The one that took a direct hit over Stuttgart and disintegrated in a ball of flame? Why not the bombardier, who froze to death at his station when the heating failed? Why not the pilot who held his crippled B-17 level long enough for his crew to bail out, then rode it down himself because there was no time left? Survivor's guilt mixed with the pride of service, creating a cocktail of emotions that took years to untangle. "You can't bomb evil," Miller said, his eyes distant. "You can only erase what it built." And so they flew mission after mission, knowing that each one might be their last. They flew because they had been ordered to. They flew because they believed in the cause. They flew because their friends were flying beside them, and you did not abandon your friends. They flew and bombed and tried not to think too hard about what happened below. By spring 1945, German soldiers no longer looked up. They didn't need to. The sound of engines meant the same thing every time: retreat, ruin, surrender. The vocabulary of defeat had been written in contrails across the German sky, lesson after lesson, until even the most fanatical believer understood that faith alone could not turn back wings. The black sky had become prophecy fulfilled. In the final months of the war, the bombing took on a different character, no longer strategic but overwhelming. There were so many bombers that they ran out of primary targets. Formations struck railway junctions that had already been destroyed. They bombed factories that had ceased production weeks earlier. They hit cities whose populations had already fled. It was not cruelty, but momentum, the unstoppable inertia of an industrial machine that had been built to destroy and could not easily be turned off. German anti-aircraft defenses, once formidable, had been reduced to gestures. Ammunition was scarce. Experienced crews were dead or captured. The guns fired sporadically more to maintain the illusion of resistance than with any real hope of stopping the raids. When Berlin fell in May, the city had been bombed more than 360 times. There were neighborhoods that existed only in memory streets that could not be found even by those who had grown up walking them. The Brandenburg Gate stood amid ruins like a tombstone marking the grave of an empire. It wasn't just armies that had lost it. It was the very idea that terror could triumph over industry, that cruelty could overcome coordination, that willpower alone could substitute for resources. The skies had proven that freedom, when organized and mobilized, could become unstoppable. This was the lesson written in smoke and rubble across a continent that democracies slow to anger and slower to arm possessed a terrible strength once roused. They did not fight for conquest or glory. They fought to end the fighting. And they brought to that task the full weight of their industrial might. Every rivet driven in Detroit was a bullet aimed at Berlin. Every woman welding in California was a soldier in the Sky War. Every factory worker, every engineer, every farmer growing food to feed the war machine, they were all part of an equation that Germany could not solve. The mathematics were brutal and simple. America could build faster than Germany could destroy. It could replace losses faster than Germany could inflict them. It could sustain a war of attrition that would grind its enemy down to dust. And it did. When German soldiers finally laid down their weapons, some with relief, some with bitter resentment, some with the hollow-eyed stare of men who had seen too much, the sky above them was still filled with the drone of engines. The bombers flew victory parades over cities they had helped to ruin, their missions finally complete. For the Germans below, watching through the haze of defeat, those aircraft represented something beyond military victory. They represented the fundamental transformation of warfare itself. The future would belong to whoever controlled the skies. Ground armies, no matter how brave or well led, could not prevail beneath a hostile sky. The lesson had been taught in fire and learned in blood, and it would never be forgotten. In the ruins of Germany, survivors found strange artifacts, melted glass, formed into twisted sculptures by heat, beyond imagination, steel beams bent like wire, fragments of bomb casings marked "Made in America." Each one was a relic of a war fought between the earth and the sky. The air war changed warfare forever. It proved that no wall, no army, no ideology could protect a nation from the consequences of its own aggression. Fortress Europe had no roof. The Atlantic Wall faced the wrong direction. Every defense Germany had built assumed enemies would come from the ground. They came from above instead. For the soldiers who once trembled beneath those darkened skies, the memory never faded. Decades later, old men would flinch at the sound of aircraft overhead. They would look up reflexively, checking for formations, counting wings, calculating trajectories their minds had learned to track during years of survival. When the sky turned black, one veteran wrote in his memoirs, 50 years after the war, "I stopped believing in victory. I stopped believing in much of anything except the need to survive one more day." The sky had spoken, and its verdict was final. War changes men, but sometimes it also changes the sky. The clouds that once carried fire now carry silence. The same skies that terrified soldiers over Schweinfurt now cradle peaceful airliners drifting over green fields where ruins once stood. Children play in parks built atop filled-in bomb craters. Cities rebuilt themselves brick by brick, choosing remembrance over resentment. In that transformation lies a quiet truth. Humanity's greatest power is not to destroy, but to rebuild. The bombers are gone. The sky is blue again. Museums preserve their memory-polished aluminum fuselages, standing in silent halls. Plaques listing crews who never came home, photographs of young men who aged decades in a single year. And history remembers not just the fear they inspired, but the peace that followed. The sky forgave us. Perhaps we can forgive each other.